Thank you everybody for attending my defense. It's great to see everybody here. Decarbonization and metallurgical coal in BC's Elk Valley. So to start, in order to address climate change, society needs to transition off of fossil fuels as rapidly as possible. But unfortunately, the necessity of decarbonization for planetary survival doesn't change the fact that there are many communities that remain economically dependent on fossil fuel extraction. And therefore, decarbonization has the potential to harm the communities, economies, and livelihoods of the millions of people that live in these communities. Now, the dichotomy, because of that economic necessity, these communities to be oppositional to decarbonization policies or plans, and that is often framed in the media as a jobs versus the environment dichotomy. However, research has shown that attitudes towards decarbonization in these communities are much more complicated. Even if a transition to renewables would be economically beneficial, it may still be rejected on social, cultural, or psychological grounds. Now, most of the research about the energy attitudes of these communities is mostly come from geography and sociology disciplines. In my view, this is a missed opportunity for environmental psychology, which so far has tended to focus on specific constructs such as place attachment or climate denial, but has so far largely avoided the community framework that grounds these constructs in a social context. And in my opinion, psychology is perfectly poised to lead in this area of directly actionable climate-centered social science research. So given that context, this brings us to my present study, and it turns out that British Columbia is actually a perfect place to be looking at these questions, because although it is a climate leader in climate action in many different domains, it is also a huge exporter of natural resources. The logging industry here is very well known, but less commonly known is the extent to which British Columbia is a source of the world's coal supply. So before moving forward, a really important thing to understand is that there are two types of coal, thermal and metallurgical. Thermal coal is the more iconic of the two and is typically used to make electricity or heat. Metallurgical coal is purer, it burns hotter, and is almost exclusively used to make steel. So as I was mentioning, Canada is the third largest exporter of metallurgical coal in the world, nearly half of which is mined in BC. So the coal mined in BC is taken from these two areas, the Tumbler Ridge area of the northeast and the Elk Valley region of the southeast. I have focused on this present study in the Elk Valley of the southeast. Comes with these four mines labeled here in the white that are all owned by a single company. And the valley itself is made up of these four communities: Fernie, Sparwood, Elkford, and Crow's Nest Pass. And importantly, Crow's Nest Pass is located just across the border to Alberta, and the mines of that community have been closed for decades, while the mines on the BC side of the border are extremely productive and generate a lot of robust economic activity. So given this context, my research questions were: how do residents of metallurgical mining communities in the Elk Valley perceive decarbonization? How are these perceptions similar or different from the other fossil fuel dependent communities described in the literature? And what psychological processes are involved in these perceptions? So my methods, given the novelty of my research questions, I decided that an exploratory study design was most appropriate. And I chose to use qualitative methods because the richness in data that qualitative methods provide are uniquely able to capture the complexities and nuances in viewpoints and the complex social cultural context that are really important to my research questions. And I chose to use a semi-structured interview approach to give me the freedom to follow emergent themes, clarify nuances and viewpoints, and develop rapport and empathy with my participants. In terms of recruitment, basically the only requirements to participate were that you had to be a long-term resident of the Elk Valley and have reasonable knowledge of the local economy. In total, I recruited 16 participants. Interviews ranged from 30 to 60 minutes and were mostly conducted individually, with the exception of 1 2-hour focus group I did with residents of the Crow's Nest Pass at their request. And the interview procedure consisted of me guiding them through 14 open-ended questions with occasional deviations to elaborate or clarify viewpoints. The interview data was then fully transcribed in vivo and fully anonymized, and a data analysis was conducted using the thematic analysis approach described in Braun and Clark, which essentially means that it was fully inductive. There were no predetermined codes used. The transcripts were read through and coded multiple times, and the emergent patterns were organized into themes and subthemes. So a really quick example of what this process looked like is here's a transcript, and I would highlight sections of the text that I recognized had a discrete concept and label it with a code. Here, environmentally responsible mining, economic benefit, reclamation. And then these codes are presented in aggregate on the right, and I would organize them, consolidate them if they were redundant. And I did this multiple times to allow patterns to begin to emerge. Now, there are many anti-bias measures taken during the study. I won't go through all of them here for brevity, but one I will point out because I do think it's important is that because of the iterative nature of thematic analysis, which means that I began analyzing interview data before I had conducted all of my interviews, it allowed me to present my preliminary findings to later interview participants so that they could review them and share if they felt like it was representative of their views or what they believed to be the views of their community. It was an important measure to reduce coder bias on my part. So my results, 7 unique themes emerged from this analysis. Given the open-ended nature of my research questions and survey approach, 2 themes were excluded from further analysis because I deemed them to be out of the scope of my research questions. Those themes were the effects of cost of living and the effects of transient workers in the mines on these communities. The remaining 5 themes constitute my 5 main findings. The first of which is that metallurgical coal is distinct from thermal coal and historical mining. The belief that metallurgical coal is an essential part of a renewable transition. The many ways in which residents of these communities identify with coal mining. The 4th finding is specific to Crow's Nest Pass for reasons I'll get into later, but focuses on the perceived outgroup threat from environmentalists. And my 5th and final finding is the lack of alternatives to mining and a precarious future. So first finding, one of the probably the most frequent concept that I encountered across all of my interviews was the distinction between metallurgical and thermal coal. Residents were very quick to emphasize the differences between these two and would portray thermal coal as with emotionally charged caricature of it being a dirty fuel, a part of the fossil fuel era, while at the same time emphasizing that metallurgical coal was a newer, cleaner mining product that was an essential building block for modern society and infrastructure. And a very similar architecture and rhetoric was used to distinguish present mining practices from historical mining practices. Residents would emphasize or admit that historical mining was really damaging to the environment, but would refer to improved technological innovations and more strict industry practices to essentially claim that the environmental concerns had been fully addressed. And really critically, these considerations of environmental impact only extended to local pollution and land use change. Carbon emissions were almost never considered as an environmental impact. And together, these distinctions ultimately obscured metallurgical coal's status as a fossil fuel. And in fact, most residents of these communities don't consider metallurgical coal a fossil fuel and instead place it in a poorly defined gray area. This leads right into my second finding, which is the belief that metallurgical coal is an essential part of a renewable transition. Residents were extremely aware and quick to emphasize how expansions in renewable infrastructure would require more steel and therefore increased demand for metallurgical coal. But on top of that, matter-of-fact accounting of coal's demand for renewable infrastructure, they saw metallurgical mining as actively in line with the environmentally progressive values of a green transition. And that was built partially on the efforts to reduce the emissions of extracting the coal, such as the electrification of mining equipment and Canada's relatively strict environmental regulations. But critically, this understanding ignores all of the emissions that come from burning the coal, which make up the vast majority of emissions in this industry. Third finding is the many ways in which residents identified with mining. one of the first things that came up when I asked about the local culture in these communities was a pride in occupation, mining as a way of life. This is what we do. And also there was a lot of pride in the beauty of the natural landscape, pride in a culture of outdoorsmanship. Everybody spent their free time outdoors, and we're very proud of that fact. And really importantly, these different bases of identification would interact and reinforce one another as legitimizing identities in which members of the community could validate one another as members of an essential team that were providing an essential service to the construction of modern society through its role in infrastructure building. And very importantly, these legitimizing identities would be mobilized into bases of resistance when confronted with perceived challenges from an outgroup, such as the perceived stigmas from urban centers. This leads to my fourth finding, the Crow's Nest Pass. As I was mentioning, because the mines in the Crow's Nest Pass have been closed for a long time, the community has slid into economic depression, whereas just 20 minutes down the road across the border to British Columbia, the mines remain open, extremely productive, and generate a lot of economic activity. And so this colored the understanding of the Crow's Nest Pass residents of these mining and environmental issues with a very pervasive sense of injustice. And when asked why this contrast existed, residents would claim that they had the support of their communities and of the larger Albertan community more so, and would blame the responsibility for this inequality on outside environmentalist groups. And there's a lot to unpack here, but essentially these residents saw themselves as fighting an asymmetric war in which large, very well-funded environmental organizations were spreading a deluge of anti-coal misinformation. And they, as a small rural community, were reluctant warriors engaging in a extremely emotionally tolling war that came with a lot of anger, isolation, and despair, but ultimately had felt that they had no choice but to defend their livelihoods. And that goes to my fifth finding, which is a lack of alternatives and precarious future, which is that across all Elk Valley communities, BC and Alberta, there was a universal recognition that the life of the communities was seen as inseparable from the mines. This had partially been internalized through historical boom and bust cycles of the coal industry, in which periods of high productivity in the mines resulted in good times for the communities, and periods of low productivity resulted in economic depression. Importantly, residents of these communities saw no viable alternatives for economic activities such as tourism or renewable energy. But really critically, because coal is a non-renewable resource, all of the communities had a deeply internalized understanding that eventually, even if it wasn't from technological progress or environmental pressures, eventually the mines would close because the coal will eventually run out. And this manifested as a sort of foreboding, looming existential threat that was universally understood but never spoken about. And therefore, conceptions of the future were always defined by loss of culture, loss of identity, loss of familial connection that is accompanied with economic depression. And imagining the future became a grieving process. So in my discussion, I'll go through my research questions one at a time. First question is, how do they perceive decarbonization? So in general, they're pro-renewables, not only because they're seen as good for business, but also because an economy of expanded renewable infrastructure would continue to legitimize their mining as essential labor. They see little threat from decarbonization more broadly outside of just a renewable energy transition as a little threat because largely they don't perceive metallurgical coal as a fossil fuel. And then held totally separately from all these environmental and energy issues, there's an understanding that any mine closures would be devastating to these communities. My second research question was the differences and similarities to these communities described in literature, and a lot of very key differences from this novel context. The most important and maybe an obvious one is that they don't see metallurgical coal as a fossil fuel. In fact, they actively resist associations with the stigmas that they perceive and, in fact, emphasize on their own of these fossil fuels. They are broadly supportive of renewable energy and decarbonization because they see their incentives as inherently aligned with steel and infrastructure, not energy. They have a non-competitive understanding of decarbonization, which is overly represented as an energy issue. They also, a very important difference from many communities described in the literature, specifically coal communities, thermal coal communities in which mines have closed, and they find themselves in degraded economic or cultural legitimacy. The communities in the British Columbia still have a retained sense of legitimacy in which they are contributing to an essential function of society, and the economy recognizes that legitimacy through economic activity. And another important difference is that because the pro-coal politics of a progressive British Columbian government are contrasted with the anti-coal politics of a conservative Albertan government, that contrast may have helped polarization of energy issues from falling along strictly ideological lines, which is very different than a lot of the context described in literature, such as in the United States, and where polarization on these issues are extremely partisan. Second part of this question is similarities. So although those are really key distinctions, there are a lot of very crucial similarities, especially the way in which these residents have a lot of pride in mining as a way of life, mining as a source of identity and a intergenerational heritage, a tradition that they're carrying on, is almost identical to the same kind of systems described on other fossil fuel dependent communities in the literature. Place attachment is really deeply understood connection that these people have, not only to the literal physical landscape, but to their understanding the meanings and symbols that they associate and imbue that landscape with meaning for. And of course, underlying all of these psychological processes is a very real economic dependence upon fossil fuel extraction that is very similar to other fossil fuel dependent communities, as well as the association between economic depression and increasingly polarized views. So the psychological processes at play, really important, are the legitimizing identities. They're multi-dimensional and interact with one another, but serve as legitimizing functions when they are not presented with a perceived challenge from the outside, in which case they can be mobilized into bases of resistance. Outgroup threat and the corrosiveness pass, a lot of complex psychological processes going on here, including the association of increasingly polarized views and a very well mobilized in-group identification in response to an outgroup threat. And then place attachment that again is rooted very deeply in that connection with the natural landscape, but also in intergenerational mining culture. But in the novel context in the Elk Valley is that there is also a lot of meaning and identification with modernizing and environmentally aware mining practices, which opens the question of, are there ways to environmentally transform these economies in ways that are place enhancing? So given these findings, my recommendations that I make for decision makers that are designing decarbonization strategies is that the Elk Valley presently represents an ideal context for preemptive engagement with a community that is dependent on fossil fuels for decarbonization strategies. Incorporation of the psychological context of these communities is going to be essential to crafting an efficient and effective transition for these communities. And involving localities in their transition designs is going to be really important to accurately aligning them to their social cultural dimensions and could mitigate perceptions that this transition is being imposed by the outside. And lastly, I think it would be very important, very wise to frame decarbonization strategies in terms of economic security, because they already understand that mine closures are in one way or another inevitable. Framing it in terms of an economic security could have sidestepped potentially polarizing energy debates and offensive associations of metallurgical coal as a fossil fuel. And last slide is limitations of future research. Many residents cited anonymity as a key requirement for participation due to fear of retribution from the mining company. This may have underrepresented vulnerable hourly workers and overrepresented salaried employees that are more secure in their employment, and therefore might be higher income or higher educated and more amenable to environmental concerns. Similar bias could be introduced from voluntary participation in snowball sampling. There was no independent coder. I did the coding myself, so I could have introduced bias on my end. And lastly, future research should better consider the active role that the coal or fossil fuel industry plays in crafting the social image that people have of resource extraction and in shaping these community narratives. It was not sufficiently considered in the present study. And that is it. That's my summary.